Hi, we're Ralph and Lahni the Amicis, and we're the astrologers for the Planetary calendar, and we've created this series of videos to help you use the calendar more effectively. So, take it away, Lahni.
The calendar was begun by Louis Pigeon in 1949, and we've been trying to keep it in line with his original purpose while bringing it up to date, making it more modern and more useful for everybody. There's so much information in the calendar that we thought that we'd make this series of short videos with tips and ideas about how to cover all the different ways that you can use the calendar. You'll be able to use the calendar to a greater and lesser degree depending upon your level of interest and astrological knowledge. So it makes a great learning tool too.
Exactly.
So first, it's a calendar to help keep track of the days.
Right.
How novel is that? While also making note of the daily sign of the moon. That's really
very important.
People always want to know what sign the moon is in. Knowing in which sign the moon is helps you plan appropriate things, and also tells you what kind of activities are supported by the emotional support of the moon, and explains the moods and trends of other people in your orbit, people that you might come in contact with, people all over the world.
Right. So, for instance, if the moon is in Aries, it's a very energized day. People tend to be much more willing to reach out to other people. You know, when the moon's in Taurus, everyone wants to go out to lunch. You know, when the moon is in Gemini, people like to flirt. So it's helpful to understand that. You know, what is the moon emotionally empowering at that time?
Well, and as important it is to know what the moon supports, it's also important to know what the moon doesn't support. So if you're trying to really get a lot of work done and the moon is in Gemini, it might explain why you can't make your attention stay on one point for a long enough period of time to get something done. Maybe it's a time to change up a little bit and decide that, you know, you're going to do small parts of little projects instead of trying to nail down that big project and wait for a nice Capricorn moon or a Virgo moon in order to do that.
I mean, after all, even in non-astrological calendars, they always put in the phases of the moon. But in an astrological calendar, the phases of the moon carry even more power because it tells you how energy is rising in the course of the month. Even in non-astrological calendars, they still want to know where the moon is because it tells you at night how much moonlight is going to be out when you go out walking to your friend's house. But in an astrological calendar, it matters much more because it has a lot to do with how is energy building in the course of the month. And you actually see in our forecast that we will note certain times in the phase when energy is either rising or it's just about to really pour out, or it's finally just kind of creeping towards the new moon and maybe you should just chill a little bit.
So the phases of the moon, or whether the energy is waxing after the new moon or waning after the full moon. And of course, we understand these kinds of energetic patterns because all you have to do is look at the tides. You've got a high tide, you've got a low tide. The moon, of course, controls all of this. Well, it also controls these cycles within ourselves. So we have high energy times, low energy times. It's very important to be able to see that.
The moon is the controller of liquids, after all, and the body is mostly liquid.
And then there's also a handy explanation of void of course moon in the calendar. This is a concept where the moon has already made the last aspect to another planet that it's going to make before it changes sign. So while before the moon was kind of on a mission, oh, I got to see this one and that one, and then I have to stop off at this one, it just becomes a wanderer. It's kind of doesn't know what to do with itself. So it's kind of treading water and just kind of trying to figure out what to do until it changes sign. And then it gets a new sense of direction.
And you see that down all the way at the bottom of the box is a pair of numbers. And it basically tells you that period of time, and sometimes it spans two boxes, the period of time when the moon is void. Of course, I describe it many times as a person is going out to do their errands, and they have a whole list of things they have to do, and they get to the final errand, and they have a big bunch of time before their next appointment, and they're kind of like, what should I do? Well, maybe I'll just wander around a little bit, and they could get into all different kinds of trouble at that time.
Well, and how many times do you feel that way during the course of your workday? You know, so if you feel like, oh, I just can't seem to concentrate, or I just can't seem to get anything done, or what was I doing, being at loose ends, you pick up the calendar, you say, oh, no wonder The moon is void of course. Let's go out and have coffee. I'll come back and finish it later.
Exactly. Time to meditate.
The other part about the moon
Okay.
that's handy is to know when the moon is in your own natal sign, the sign of the moon in your natal chart.
Yes.
It's a time when you feel comfortable, you feel centered, your mood is usually higher than in some other signs where you might be square to your natal sign or something like that. So people generally like that original moon sign, and it's a handy way for you to look and see when that moon is going to be in your natal sign.
It can also be a time when you feel more emotional too, though, because it's empowering your emotions. And generally, it's good if people are more in touch with their emotions. But also keep in mind when the moon is opposite your moon position. Like, for instance, if your moon is in Gemini, when the moon is set in Sagittarius, it's opposite that. And you're kind of at the polarity at that point, and you may find it hard to kind of get off the dime emotionally because it seems like the whole environment, everything's happening over there. So you keep track of these things.
And because the moon is so close to the planet Earth, the moon is so personal, is so tied to emotions, that if that's all the information you got from the planetary calendar, it would be helpful and supportive, and it would be well worth having the calendar as a reference.
Yep.